Okay, so thank you everybody who is connecting with us this morning, afternoon for some of you. It's my pleasure to have here with me Paddy de Alay, Professor of Law at the American University Washington College of Law and the Director of the Trade Investment and Development Program, and Nasim Mahaboubi, who is a research scholar of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania, as well as a lecturer in law at Penn Law School. We are expecting for Charles Freeman, who is the Senior Vice President for Asia at the US Chamber of Commerce. Today we are going to discuss a little bit for the next hour about China. And specifically, we are happy to have Nasim with us because I think he's going to cover a lot of the EU-China Comprehensive Investment Agreement and the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, both recently signed by China at the end of 2020. But before we do that, I would like to start posing a question to Paddy de Alay with regards to the Belt and Road Initiative, because we saw this Monday that the Council of Foreign Relations, they just launched a report on the Belt and Road Initiative, and it basically it's a report that covers the world's largest infrastructure program. It poses significant challenge to U.S. economic, political, climate change, security, and global health interests. So, Paddy, if you could start just providing your remarks, your views on this report, on China as a whole, and then we jump to the trade talk itself.
So before, thank you, Renata, and thank you, Nasim, for joining us, and hopefully Charles will join us as well. I just want to mention to all of our participants that this is going to be a series of trade insights that we have launched. This is going to be the first that we will do on a bi-monthly basis. So welcome. I wanted to just, before I talk about this report that was just issued by the Council of Foreign Relations, you can't see it because I've got the fake background, so I can't put anything up. This report is interesting, and I will talk about it momentarily, which is, as Renata said, deals with the Belt and Road Initiative of President Xi Jinping, who basically, it was launched in 2013. The idea is to sort of initially to connect China's modern coastal cities to its underdeveloped interiors and to its Southeast, Central, and South Asian neighbors, and cementing China's position at the center of a more connected world. But the initiative has since outgrown its original regional corridors, and as the report says, it's expanded to all corners of the globe. And it includes now a digital Silk Road, as it's named, and even a health Silk Road with the pandemic, designed to basically operationalize China's vision in for example, in both the digital reign as well as the global health perspective. The report does put some concerns forward. The concerns being that this program, this Chinese initiative, is worrying because it undermines global macroeconomic stability, increases the likelihood that the debt crisis will materialize over the coming years by largely eschewing debt sustainability analysis that the Chinese are not engaging in, and funding economically questionable projects in already heavily indebted countries, that it's subsidizing privileged market entry for Chinese state-owned and non-market-oriented companies, and it's enabling China to lock countries into a Chinese ecosystem by pressing its technology and preferred technical standards. It also is ensuring dependence on carbon incentive power, etc., making it harder for the World Bank and other traditional lenders to insist on high standards. So it's very wide reaching, from climate change and environmental concerns to geopolitical concerns and development concerns. The task force ultimately makes a recommendation, and the recommendation it requires basically the US to enhance its commercial diplomacy, to promote high quality, high standard alternatives to this Belt and Road Initiative, to start offering more technical support because there was a vacuum that China has filled, to devote an additional $100 billion to federal research and development in developing next generation technologies, increase investment in STEM education, and so on and so forth, including reforming the US Development Finance Corporation Export-Import Bank so that we can basically compete with what the Chinese are doing. This is all fine and good, and maybe we can have a discussion about this with Nason, but I want to talk about another point that was a bigger picture that was put actually in The Economist today or yesterday when I got it, about dealing with China. Recently, thanks to Nason, I was actually on a Chinese global TV, and I was asked the question, why is the United States linking trade and human rights for China when it's not linking it for Russia? And they have a human rights. Look what they have done. And so the response for me was, of course, that the relationship with Russia is not a very good one either, given what's happening between President Biden and Putin, but President Putin. But the reality is that we don't have that kind of a trade situation with Russia. And that was also the case when Russia wanted to enter into the WTO. There was always concern that Russia will not really care about the trading rules because their major exports are energy. And the energy sector is a completely different situation. And our agreements with Russia are mostly the STAR Treaty and others that it come to a different level. The way in which we are entangled or coupled, West is, with communist Russia was never the way in the Soviet Union, the way it is with China. So the situation cannot really be compared. And that's where I think the confusion is happening now, in the sense that we usually could impose sanctions and we can say that, when you become autocratic, people will stop investing in your country. That hasn't happened. Hong Kong, China just cut the shares of directly elected legislators, and they're going to be vetted for patriotism, quote unquote. But this has not stopped investment in Hong Kong. We are talking about 10 trillion investments in Hong Kong. Is experiencing a financial boom. Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs are there. This is all pointed out by the Economist article, which is so interesting. In mainland China, Siemens, Apple, Starbucks, they all have wonderful things to say about what's going on in terms of their relationships there. So there is some understanding something else is going on, that regardless of how thuggish maybe the government may be with regards to its human rights record, there is some amount of stability. It's not translating into instability in the economic sector, that they will continue to provide the stability that business requires, and that we are connected that way. So this is really a negation of what the expectation of the world was when the accession of the China into the WTO happened in 2001. The idea was, and the belief was, that the more integrated they became into the world economy, that the more freer they would be. That has not come to pass. The US has been upset at that and has taken some of that upset, I think, being upset about that at the WTO as an institution. While the WTO was never set up and equipped to deal with containing China or dealing with systematic differences that exist. So the story is really not finished. What are we going to do? So the Belt and Road Initiative has to be seen, I think, and this report within this broader context. Okay, we are talking about the transatlantic alliance right now. Anthony Blinken is different than the Trump administration. He speaks French fluently. He's lived in Paris. He's a multilateralist. He's an interventionist. Okay, so he will work well with the Europeans. But the Europeans are divided too. I mean, they, as Nason would say, they did sign this comprehensive agreement between EU and China at the time when the US was telling them, please don't do it, when the Biden administration was just getting on board, and wait, because we need to have a united perspective. The European response is, we're just trying to level the playing field to what your phase one and what access you created for your companies for the European ones. But the reality is that the automotive industry in Germany and other EU members like Hungary don't agree and do like the business relationship with China. So we are not in the way as united as we may think, or maybe we can't be. It's a complicated framework from which we are working, and that's what I think Antony Blinken is trying to maneuver. And we cannot disentangle completely. And, you know, can we invest $100 million, $100 billion in federal research? We'll be able to create a competing framework. We'll be able to invest in infrastructure around the world the way China is doing. I agree personally that that kind of debt imposed on the countries and infrastructure, building of infrastructure, does not lead to development in those countries. This is a long history. When the World Bank was created in 1947, they started doing infrastructure development. Good roads do not necessarily lead to development. So what is there to do? What are we going to do with China, given that we also need it and our industry is there? That's why I was so much hoping that that Charles would be here as well to talk to us about the US business perspective on China. So this is our quandary. I mean, the only recommendation I would give is that we need to keep what we are doing in terms of cultural and educational exchanges, because regardless of what happens, once people understand what's going on, their freedom of expression, freedom to think and disagree, that is bound to have an influence on the public and the sentiments in China eventually. Now, I'm not Pollyannic to think that things happen overnight. People are happy if their economic welfare is addressed, but at some point they do want more. And I think that for that reason, we cannot disengage with China. I'm totally opposed to any kind of, especially educational exchange and all of that. I think it's extremely, extremely important if we want to be able to influence. And my grandmother used to say, God's short patience is 40 years. Can you imagine what its long patience would be? This is a translation from Persian, but basically saying that, yes, things look maybe difficult for the United States. I think that there's a feeling in China and maybe elsewhere that the US is in decline, that the US is divided. And the country has become inward looking. I can tell you that as somebody who works in academia in the international law program. We have become inward looking because of our own inward problems. But we should be aware that should not be a sign of weakness, but sign of strength, in that notwithstanding our internal divisions, we still express certain values that and there's a certain strength to a democracy that can address those challenges. We came to a brink, we have come to a difficult path, but we have to be very careful. We are concerned, and I think this report is concerned that we became inward looking, and that as a result, we withdrew from TPP and other things, and we left the stage, allowing for another rising power to take that road. I've been sort of freewheeling, but that's where I'm going to end and leave it to Nason.
Excellent, Padide. Thank you so much for setting the stage. About Charles Freeman, he might be connecting at any moment. He sent me a message saying he's wrapping up an urgent call. I don't know what happened. So he might be joining us at any moment. Nason, I would like to give you the opportunity to react to Padide's comments. I'm sure you have some reaction to that, but also after that, please just jump in trade politics. I know that most of the people here connected want to listen to your comments on the investment agreement with the EU and RCEP. So please, the floor is yours.
Sure, thank you very much. And It's an honor to be part of the first of these, I guess it's going to be a series of trade talks. So thanks to Patty Day and yourself for inviting me. Yes, I do want to speak about the politics of trade that are surrounding China and the US now with the new administration. But I do want to respond a little bit to a few of the things that Patty just said, which I generally agree with very much. There was a lot there, and I'm going to just put a pin in 2 points that I'm not going to speak to too much, but I just want to express my strong agreement. One, on the importance of educational exchange ongoing. If that's something people want to come back to, I'm happy to speak at great length about that. I guess secondly, there was another point, Paja, that you said that I also agree with very much, but at the very end of your comments, but now it's slipping my mind. So I'll put that aside for now. The two things that you said that I did want to say a little bit more about. One was how to differentiate the US relationship with China from the US relationship with Russia. This is something that I think merits a little additional commentary, because there is a certain strand of thinking in American foreign policy circles to kind of group China and Russia together. This was certainly the case in the national security strategy of the Trump administration, and to this day, when people like McMaster, the former national security advisor, when he talks about these countries, he often loops them together. And I think the right response to that is to say you really can't view the two countries, Russia and China, and their role in the global order and the relationship with the US in the same way. I'm not an expert on Russia, but it does seem to be the case that Russia tends to be more of a revisionist power that on the whole has not done well under the terms of the global liberal economic order. So Russia does seem to be a power that is interested in attacking some of the premises of the global liberal economic order. That is not the case for China. In fact, China has done quite well under the premises of the global liberal economic order. So if anything, China's done too well, and we're concerned about some of the premises of the global liberal economic order, which has allowed China to do so well. So to not understand that differentiation, I think, is a major failing in the thinking of McMaster and some others. And if you just think about the US trade relationships with the two countries, there's nothing in the US-Russia trade relationship which comes close to the degree to which the US and China's economic ties are so close and intertwined. Whether it's supply chains, whether it's businesses, whatever you want to talk about, the US and China have a very close economic relationship, which has survived even with all the tensions and, back and forth rhetoric of the past few years. So I think that's very important. Again, agreeing with the thrust of your comments that we really do have to view these two countries and their relation with the US differently. The second, on BRI, I have had a chance to speak a few times about BRI, including at American University a couple of years ago. And, and I have looked at the Council on Foreign Relations report. I think it's perfectly fine to criticize aspects of how China has engaged in its lending with respect to the BRI. It's certainly fair to see the soft power components of China's approach to the BRI and to be concerned about. So, to the extent that reports like the Council on Foreign Relations or the general discourse at DC tends to be critical of BRI for those reasons, I totally can endorse that. But I do think that any discussion of BRI in the US also needs to include three other factors or three other considerations. Consideration one is the fact that there was a need for infrastructure development in Central Asia in particular, Southeast Asia as well, that not only the US, but the World Bank neglected for a very long time. So there's an actual need in that region. Second, we're not to this day offering a real alternative. The Trump administration did put a little bit of money into I forget the name of the new agency that in theory was, going to be some kind of a vehicle for offering an alternative financing mechanism. It's not a lot of money. And it's not clear that it's that, has done much even with that small amount of money. So long time need, we're not really, apart from Mike Pompeo going to these countries and saying, don't take the Chinese money, we're not really offering an alternative. And third, when you think about the way that China is interacting with these other countries, it's not just a one-way discussion. Those countries actually want China to come in and help build things. And some of the choices about what to build are much more driven by the agenda of those host countries than by the Chinese agenda. Dan Markey has a book that really goes through a lot of this very well, and he especially focuses on Pakistan, where he talks about the politics of Pakistan has been what's driven the choices of what to ask the Chinese to work on. The famous in Sri Lanka, the Hambantota port that everyone likes to use as an example of the excesses of BRI. That's not from the Chinese side that they picked that port. That's from the Sri Lankan side that they wanted that port. So I just think we need to introduce these nuances into any of the discussion about the BRI. So I know I've gone on a little too long in reacting to Parida's very full and interesting comments. Let me add a few additional points, new points on the politics of trade. And I'll just group a couple of points. The first thing I just want to say is that, it's clear that the current new Biden administration doesn't yet know exactly how they're going to navigate the new world of trade. And there's lots of different ways of seeing that point, but one way that's very visible to me is that there are all these different things the Trump administration did that the Biden people have rolled back very quickly. Whether it's, the climate accord, whether it's, domestic policy things, whether it's reaching out to allies, lots of things that they've done very quickly. They have not touched any of the tariffs that the Trump administration imposed on China, which is just interesting, right? That component of Trump policy remains fully in place. And I was listening to an interesting discussion with Chad Bowen from the Peterson Institute the other day, and he was talking about some of the reasons why those tariffs have become so sticky. And this is an area where I'm sure Patty will know much more than I do, but something that Chad Bowen said, which I found very interesting, he said, once you have tariffs, it creates its own constituency. So it's sort of hard to roll them back. There's not an easy momentum to rolling them back. And on top of that, apart from whatever constituency that's now sort of like learned how to do trade around the tariffs, the Biden people, I think they still don't really know how to navigate the new understanding of trade in US domestic politics, which is that, yes, there were benefits to the approach that we took in the last 25, 30 years, and particular around the NAFTA and China's accession to the WTO and expanding global supply chains, all of that stuff. Yes, there are benefits, but those benefits tended to be concentrated and not equally shared within American society, and that's a problem. It's a problem both if you think in terms of equity, but it's also just a problem in terms of then the political reaction to the inequitable distribution of those benefits. So I don't think they know how to navigate this new terrain. And so what you see is that they've just stuck. They don't really know, do they leave the tariffs on? I guess they're going to do that for now. But for sure, and if Charles Freeman will join, I'm sure he would say that the US business perspective generally is probably hoping to bring the tariffs down. Another point of friction on this is—
Charles is on.
Yeah, and then another point of friction on this would be the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right? So there's a lot of people who feel that the most effective way of addressing the new challenges, the new competition from China's economic model is to kind of get at the way in which they support their state-owned enterprises, to limit the monopolistic nature of Chinese state-owned enterprises, which are supported by funding from the government. And the most effective way of getting at that is through something like a Trans-Pacific Partnership, which is attractive to China. China would want to be part of a trade bloc like that. And if the rules of joining a trade bloc like that are that you have to fundamentally, or at least substantially, change the premises of your economic model and supporting your state-owned enterprises like that, that provides a powerful incentive for China to do that. So I think within the trade community, there's long been this notion that really one of the most effective strategic tools in our arsenal for changing the Chinese economic approach is through something like the TPP. But again, the domestic politics in the US have made the TPP something that, President Hillary Clinton would not have been able to do. President Trump was clearly not interested in, and President Biden at the moment is not interested in. unless, the business community represented by Charles and US Chamber and other business interests put a lot of pressure over the next couple of years, because, the TPP and its new terminology of the CPTPP is continuing on. And at some point, US businesses are going to be annoyed that they're left out. From the Chinese side, I've been saying so much about how the US side is navigating these sort of different considerations. But thankfully, we live in a world where we're not the only country that has to navigate difficult situations. The Chinese are also navigating difficult situations. And so let me just say a final word about the comprehensive agreement on investment with the EU. When this was announced a few months ago, it was clearly a PR victory for China, because it came exactly at the moment when the new administration was gearing up to take power. And their big idea for how they were going to combat China was, okay, we are going to reassert our alliances, especially with European countries. And so just at that moment, as they're about to come into power and they're signaling that their big idea is that we're going to work with European allies and partners to combat the economic challenge from China, at that exact moment, China and the EU announced this investment agreement. It came as I think, it deflated a lot of and even Jake Sullivan from the National Security Council, tweeted his disappointment. And it was clear that the Biden people were caught off guard, and maybe they shouldn't have been caught off guard. I'm not saying that's defensible, but they were, and they were having some trouble processing it. So that was a victory for China from a public relations standpoint. Now, we did know that there was going to be some pushback in the European Parliament in terms of ratifying the comprehensive investment agreement on investment. We knew that that was going to be a problem, because its terms tended to be favorable to the big companies, which are usually associated with Germany or France, and there was less in there for the smaller countries in Europe. And there were these concerns about human rights practices in China, in particular the situation of the Uyghurs in Xinjiang province, that the agreement tried to kind of address with its clauses on forced labor and stuff like that, but generally was viewed not to be sufficient. So there was already some choppy waters. But then when the other day, the EU announced these very minimal, very targeted sanctions on some officials that are associated with the Chinese government's policy in Xinjiang, not at all as broad or as intrusive as the sanctions that the US has imposed for that reason. Immediately after the EU announced these, China hit back with some very extensive sanctions on a whole range of European actors, whether they be members of the European Parliament or units like MERICS, which are think tanks in Europe that study China, or individual European academics. And so, whatever the politics were in the European Parliament against ratification of the agreement, I think just went up by many degrees. And it's just interesting from if you're just trying to think of the strategy of different actors, why China would have thought to sort of undermine their own PR win by potentially blowing up this agreement with our actions from the other day is a bit of a puzzle. Okay, so I've gone on for too long. Let me stop here, and I'm happy to go back and cover this ground in more detail as we continue the discussion.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Nathan. And we have the honor to have here Charles Freeman, who is the Senior Vice President for Asia at the US Chamber. So Charles, we would love to hear your comments from US business perspectives, the opportunities, the challenges emerging from this new trade paradigm. So the floor is yours, Charles.
Well, thank you very much, Renata, and thanks to, sorry I was a bit late, but it's great to be joining you today. Just a few reflections, and I'm gonna just talk about what business has been looking for in trade policy for a long time, which is really certainty and a level playing field, and enforceable rules of the road. And that what business has been pushing for years and years has been market access to other economies, whether that's China in 2001 or through the negotiation of the TPP, and even through efforts to revise NAFTA, rightly or wrongly, and open up Japan on the digital side and agricultural side in the wake of the somewhat dubious decision to exit TPP. You know, and I think that continues to be our focus. That is not, as I think is clear from earlier comments, that's not the focus of either popular opinion with respect to trade, or the politics surrounding trade. And so we're left in a bit of a quandary of how we kind of navigate and how we push for equal access that the Chinese are negotiating through RCEP or through CAI. And I recognize that particularly in the wake of the reciprocal sanctions that went into place, that CAI is a little less likely to be ratified in the European Parliament. But but by and large, the administration, whether it's the Trump administration or the Biden administration, seems to have clipped its own wings a bit with respect to negotiations, and so we are left struggling to kind of articulate the benefits and the positives of trade in ways that, frankly, have never fit easily into kind of a 25-word or less tweet. It's hard to articulate the benefits of trade because they are dispersed. I would disagree slightly with Nisun about the distribution of trade benefits from past trade agreements falling disproportionately, or being falling disproportionately or on a select group. I think actually the benefits have been pretty widely dispersed, and the negative parts of trade, the losers from trade, have been fairly concentrated. And in American politics, that squeaky wheel or gets the grease, as it were. So they tend to take up more of the political space. The losers from trade tend to take up more of the oxygen on the politics thereof, until but trade by and large has been a bit of a scapegoat for many years, and I'll tell a story from my time at when I was at USTR, and this was right after the WTO accession. So probably about 2004, 2005. I was looking at or my team and I were looking at the statistics of U.S.-China trade, and recognized that actually, despite the criticisms from Congress that this was costing thousands or hundreds of thousands of American jobs, the actual numbers, the job losses, were not in areas which were trade sensitive to China. Most of those were in kind of traditional manufacturing jobs, which had been, losing out for years. And I negotiated with the U.S. International Trade Commission to do a study on the impact of opening markets between U.S. and China through the WTO accession process, through the imposition of permanent normal trade relations. And so I negotiated that study that they were going to do, and then I wrote the press release and sent it up through the Office of Management and Budget to be approved. And I got called into the White House almost immediately and was asked, "What are you trying to do here?" And I said, "Well, I'm trying to prove that the president's trade policies with respect to China are not the problem in the loss of manufacturing jobs in the United States." And the response was, "Well, okay, so whose fault are they?" And I said, "Well, it's the ordinary rough and tumble of a market economy where you have enormous dynamism, and including productivity changes, which are forcing people out of the workforce in manufacturing and into services, the same way that in the first part of the 20th century, people were forced out of agriculture and moved into manufacturing. It's a very similar trend." And the response was, "Well, so you're saying it's it's not the Chinese fault, it's our fault. It's our policy fault. You can't do that study. So I think the issue is that, trade is easily scapegoated because the constituencies in favor of trade are besides the multinationals that the chamber represents and the business community generally, the trade does create some losers, but the ordinary market economy creates losers as well as winners, and the losers tend to be outspoken, and trade is an easier thing to blame, right? It just is. So I rather than trying to reconfigure our entire economy. But all that said, I mean, we're as we kind of struggle with how to reinvigorate a more liberalized trade agenda. I think we're seeing the China factor be an enormous challenge, and we are really looking now as a country, doing some soul searching about what kind of economy we need to have in order to be globally competitive with a country with such an enormous scale and such an ability to kind of put a thumb on the scales of fairness globally. When you have massive subsidies directed in China towards particular industries, that has a globally distortive effect, and it's challenging enough for American business to compete just on that basis. And when because of security or other concerns, you are restricting the access of American businesses to the Chinese economy, that reduces the competitive edge of American businesses, particularly in technology, but more broadly, in a significant way. So we are really thinking within the Congress, within business, within policymakers generally, we're thinking about how do we manage the China challenge? How do we manage this globally distortive series of practices? One means that Naesun raised was the desire to go off and make sure that we negotiate with allies and friends and try to build a kind of quarantine around distortive Chinese behavior. But the other piece may be to actually change the way we fund innovation here in this country and increase the public option there. Business is not quite sure where they come out on that. We've been pretty successful to date on a largely market-based approach globally. And for years and years, the working assumption by trade negotiators and trade policymakers and the business community has been that other countries, other economies were converging with a U.S. style or U.S. approach, or that the ideological bases behind the WTO, right? That the goal is to reduce the ability of governments to restrict trade. That what you want is to have the least trade restrictive economic policies possible. With the rise of China and the change in the shift in the Chinese direction away from a move towards the market has really changed a lot of those inherent assumptions about trade policy, about economic policy domestically, and it's changed the thought process in boardrooms in this country.
Excellent remarks. I know after listening to the three of you, I think we have a lot to discuss, but we have only 15, 17 minutes. But maybe I'll make another round, starting with Naesun. Now, I know you have some reactions to what Charles just said, specifically on the strategic alliances, but I would like you to also comment on the RCEP, the fact that South Korea, China, Japan are all together in this super agreement. India is out. What does that mean? And also, maybe we can make a deep dive on Biden administration and China. What can we expect? What's happening? So, Nathan.
Sure, thank you. And I just wanted to first just add a couple of quick reactions to Charles' excellent comments. First, I take his point and I agree that the better formulation in respect to the impact of trade in the US economy and politics is to say that the benefits were generally diffuse, but some of the costs were concentrated. I think, one could potentially add another layer to that, which is some of the, benefits were also concentrated, but generally speaking, we all got to buy things that were cheaper, across the board. But then some people, particularly in manufacturing sectors, got really, really hurt. Whether, then we could maybe have difference of opinion on, how do you proceed from there? But regardless of that, it's clearly the case that especially in the new politics that former President Trump facilitated and is still part of the language of President Biden, paying attention to those costs, those concentrated costs is here to stay. So that's just a point of agreement and a slight addition to that. The other thing, I'm very glad that Charles mentioned the point at the last section of his comments on how we're going to potentially approach our economic model now going forward with respect to the challenge from China. I think this is a very interesting discussion that's happening right now. And you can see it across a lot of different areas. You can see it in the area of infrastructure. You can see it in the area of federal funding for research and development. I do not know how all of this stuff, first of all, I don't have a very good view on what's the right pitch for each of these things. And I don't know how it's going to play out. It seems to me arguable that there was a not that long ago period of time in the US where we did put more state resources into things like infrastructure, into things like research and development. And we just stopped doing that in the course of the last 40 years of, maybe higher limits on regulation and also, tax cuts for businesses and all those things. That's an arguable point. And so now we might be reconsidering some of that. And in particular, because we're seeing China, which seems to be better on those things, at least on the surface, offering this challenge. I think it's a very complex picture. I wish we had hours more to talk about it, because then there's also a part of the discussion that is questioning whether what accounts for China's economic success is what they think it is, because there's another way of discussing why the Chinese economy took off in the 1980s, which has less to do with state investment in its own economy and more to do with the state backing off and empowering Chinese entrepreneurs at the local level to create all this new economic activity. So it's very complex, but I'm really glad that at least we're putting a pin in that discussion, and maybe someday we can have a longer discussion about it. I know you really want me to say something about RCEP, but I don't want to take up too much time. The only thing I want to just say about RCEP is what I find most interesting about it is that even though it's proceeding, China still seems tempted by the CPTPP. So what I don't have an answer to, but what interests me as a question is what is missing in the RCEP that makes China still intrigued about joining the CPTPP? And on top of that, if the CPTPP is such a powerful sort of model that China's so interested in, how much that underscores strategically how perhaps foolish we are in not ourselves continuing to be part of that and using that as a vehicle to try to impact the Chinese economic model in ways that we think would be good.
Excellent comments. Thank you, Nathan. I actually wanted to confirm that about this CPTPP. So thank you so much. Charles, would you like to give a few comments on the Biden administration, how the business sector is seeing it, the relationship with China, where is it going?
Well, we're in a honeymoon period, obviously, still with the Biden administration, and I, I think the business community right now is encouraged that there is an open dialogue with the key parts of the administration in ways which even were different from the conversations that we were having with the Trump administration, and I think part of there's a kind of return to regular order in terms of how decisions are made, and so from that standpoint, that kind of more certain environment is good for business. With respect to China, you're right. I mean, we would love to see the tariffs come down. We certainly recognize that the Biden administration is unlikely to do that until they take a complete inventory of everything, of all the tools in their toolkit. We don't know yet the extent to which the Biden administration actually has the appetite to engage in bilateral discussions on trade issues, bilateral negotiations on trade issues with the Chinese. Catherine Tai, who's enormously talented, who's the new U.S. trade representative, in her confirmation hearings, was fairly dismissive of the utility of bilateral negotiations with China, and gave a pretty half-hearted endorsement of the Lighthizer agreement of early 2020, so-called phase one deal. She basically said, well, it's the only deal we have right now, and we'll hope they're going to abide by it. That's not that encouraging. I think from the business community standpoint, we recognize huge frustrations that the administrations have successively had in dealing with China through these strategic dialogues, where seems to be very few kind of tangible outcomes where China actually changes parts of its regulatory approach on market access. But from a business community standpoint, the changes that were made through those dialogues had a genuine impact on our ability to be successful in that market, and to manage some of the challenges from that market. So, as frustrating as these exercises are, where you have to bring the entire cabinet over to have a conversation, and you end up with minor changes on the regulatory approach to biotechnology approvals or something, that still has a tangible benefit, and it's iterative and not that sexy, and doesn't answer Bernie Sanders' key questions about trade, but they're real. So we do hope that the Biden administration will come back to to recognize the value of bilateral interaction, even while they are pursuing a multilateral approach, with traditional friends and allies that is unquestionably China directed, although no one will admit that freely.
Excellent comments. I totally agree. And I was actually thinking that we have to consider, maybe as a background, the not warm meeting from last week in Alaska, right? Last Thursday was not okay, but not that welcoming. So, Paddy, I would like to give you the chance to comment on this excellent remark.
I mean, Alaska was interesting. Somebody was telling me, that they chose Alaska. There was so much posturing that happened before Alaska by both sides. They're doing it in Alaska because it's closer to Beijing. It's halfway. The U.S. saying they're doing it in Alaska because it's in U.S. territory. And then we, of course, got together with the Quad. We had the meeting with South Korea. And you know, and all the finger pointing that happened. I just don't. I'm hesitant to put too much into those things, because I think that they needed to do that song and dance for all sorts of reasons. But it concerns me because I think the phase one agreement may not have been, I mean, it's not ideal, but there was market for American products. And I think it matters to American business if those things are, if those markets exist and they continue to have. I mean, the Europeans, the Germans, for one thing, signed that European agreement because of the phase one agreement. So I'm hoping that we don't blow it on our sides. I mean, there has to be a back and forth. And there are issues that we have to work with China on, climate change being one, the nuclear accord in Iran being the next, and the situation possibly in Afghanistan, which is at the border of China. I mean, we can't forget all those other issues as well that we have to deal with. So I don't know how you fight on one hand and play well on the other. There has to be some give and take. I am intrigued by what Charles said, because when, as I was mentioning, when the WTO, I remember in 2001, the accession was happening, I think there was a feeling that this is going to be good. China is going to be forced to be freer once it's integrated. And maybe to some extent they have been. I mean, that's what Nassan's comment is saying. You know, it did give certain amount of freedom to people in industry. So the narrative shouldn't be as negative, but things haven't turned out the way we thought they would. And the interesting thing is that now we're questioning our own system. And this is where I want you to maybe talk a little bit more, because this is where I think the rubber hits the you know, in many ways, we're questioning the equity of our system beyond just our China US relations. I mean, that's an internal issue that we are having. And as you say, you know, all the people who trade can be a scapegoat in some ways as well. But we do find that we live in an inequitable society where you have got these extremely rich, you know, taxed low, below, and then the dwindling middle class. I mean, there is a reality of our existence in the United States, and that we can't hide from either. So all of this is merging together, and I feel like the trade is sort of, they don't know what to do with trade, because trade has sort of become entangled with our own maybe failure of our own system as well. Any thoughts you have on that would be appreciated.
I know we have very limited time left, but it's such a good conversation. I wish we had more time. Let me just say very quickly, just a couple of quick reactions. First is the politics of Alaska are genuinely fascinating. The Alaska meeting, Ryan Haas from Brookings gave a great presentation on a webinar yesterday. And he was just noting that, you know, Hawaii is about the same distance, right? So the fact that they picked this cold, you know, Alaskan environment as opposed to warm and sunny Hawaii, it says that there was a lot of this sort of thinking in the background, how to make this as uncomfortable a meeting as possible. And, you know, I've said this a number of times in media appearances the last couple of days. It's very clear that at least in the public part of that discussion, they weren't talking to each other. Each of them were talking to their domestic audiences. And like you said, Patty, it may be that they needed to do that for their respective reasons, but at some point, they will also need to talk to each other. You know, as much as we understand like the domestic politics in both countries require certain kinds of statements, at some point they do need to actually talk to each other, because there are so many issues on which, you know, not only is cooperation possible, but it may be required. The range of things, whether it be things like climate change and public health, or even like these particular questions like what to do with North Korea, what to do with Iran, what to do with Afghanistan, go on. The second very quick thing is just to say that I feel like the phase one trade agreement is now being sort of, a lot of people are sort of like dumping on it. But when it was announced, many people, including people you wouldn't necessarily think would think it was a good thing, did think it was had some very beneficial aspects. It included the purchases of the soybeans and stuff like that, but there was also inroads in agriculture and some other areas, but also some things that had to do with China's approach to intellectual property, tech transfer that seemed quite positive. And there was this narrative that, well, let's see if the phase two thing plays out. And, you know, the phase two was supposed to get more at the subsidies, But a lot of people really did think the phase one on its own terms wasn't that bad. And it seems to me the main failing is that probably because of COVID, the soybean purchases ended up being much lower than anticipated. But I think I would push back a little bit on this current narrative that the phase one trade agreement was silly. I think there was actually some positive things there that are a benchmark for maybe productive bilateral discussions going forward. The last very quick thing, just on the WTO question and China's accession to the WTO and what impact that had on the Chinese economy. I just want to recommend to everyone a fantastic article that was just published in Foreign Affairs by Yeling Tan, a political scientist at the University of Oregon, titled "How the WTO Changed China," because it really speaks to this narrative that WTO accession ended up just strengthening China, and it ended up being a strategic miscalculation to allow them into the WTO, because the article really goes into depth in the ways in which WTO accession actually forced China to change economically in ways that we wanted it to, and that will continue to have a change. So she says in her article, ultimately the Chinese system is not likely to prove strong enough to completely resist the liberalizing effects of globalization, so China still lives under the shadow of its entry into the WTO. And I think that's a type of approach that's very nuanced and sophisticated that is a little bit missing in the current DC discourse about China and the WTO.
Excellent, Nathan. We are running out of time, but I would like to give Charles and Paddy the opportunity of final remarks, if you wish. Charles?
Yeah, just very, very briefly in response to the question about WTO positives and negatives in terms of China's accession. If you look at the Xi Jinping course correction, or the autocratic, the return to kind of party first, party above all else, cult of personality thing, I think in many respects you can say that was as much a reaction to the changes that were wrought by WTO as anything else. And as Xi Jinping looked out and with a view towards preserving the power of the party, I think that I think the increase in the ability of relatively independent actors in business and in the non-governmental sphere in China, the rise of those constituencies and the rise of the middle class in China was, I think, worrisome to those that wanted to preserve the party's dominant role in society. And so in many ways, the reactionary moves that Xi Jinping put in place and that kind of have put us where we are today really were responsive to the dramatic changes that WTO wrought, including changes that were really quite good for the United States.
Excellent comments. So this was a fantastic start for our Trading Site series. Thank you so much. Thank you, Paddy, Charles, Nathan. We are planning to have one high-level trade talk every month, just as this one. So thank you for a great kickoff, and I hope we can regroup again at some point to talk about China and the US.
We didn't get to talk about you, Renata, but Renata is a very distinguished Brazilian lawyer who has represented the government of Brazil in WTO dispute. So maybe next time we can talk about that, because Brazil has its own relationships with China as well, and the United States.
Oh, that's true. Yeah, thank you so much, Paddy. Thank you, everyone. We are recording and we are going to post on our website afterwards. Thank you so much.
Thank you both for joining us. Thank you all. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.